Hello, I'm your host, Peter Sawchuk, Professor of Adult Education and Workplace Learning at the University of Toronto. You're listening to Work, Learning, and Social Change, Foundational Voices, an informal discussion with some of the figures who have helped to define the field. In this episode, I'm speaking with Darcy Martin, longtime Canadian labor educator, activist, and author. With work spanning 5 decades, he is known as one of the most defining figures of labor education, work, and social change. Welcome and a hello. Our discussion series is meant to be informal, but let me begin with a few prepared remarks by way of introduction to our guest. I first met Darcy Martin in the 1990s, and during that time, he played an enormous role in shaping the direction of my own research on work, learning, and social change. But well before, as well as during and that period, he was in the process. He had completed a master's degree and then completed a doctorate degree, all from the University of Toronto. Initially, first in the 1970s, his work focused on Latin America and popular education movements. This linked well with his efforts at the time to help establish and help lead the Development Education Center and then later the Doris Marshall Institute. Later, with his doctorate dissertation, he would turn his attention to labor education, thus from the 1980s through to today, really, first working for the United Steelworkers Union of America Union, then as a national education representative for the Communication, Energy, and Paper Workers Union, and eventually as a consultant with a wide variety of labor unions and other progressive groups in Canada and elsewhere. He would eventually solidify a reputation as one of the country's preeminent critical adult labor educators. He's an author or co-author of books that have virtually defined the relationship, in my view, between popular education and labor education, including a book entitled Education for a Change, also Education for Changing Unions, as well as the renowned sole-authored book, Thinking Union, Activism and Education in Canada's Labor Movement, all available from Between the Lines Press. And I remember getting a signed copy of one of these things that are still floating around, Darcy, Thinking Union, and I still refer to it regularly. He is a member of the Canadian Association for the Study of Adult Education Hall of Fame, and he's most of all known as a passionate voice of experience and expertise regarding the labor movement, activism, work and learning in Canada, and also as one of the relatively rare bridge builders across the Anglo and Franco-Canadian labor movements. With that as an introduction, Darcy, how are you? How are you doing?
Well, hello, good afternoon, Peter, and whoever else might be tapping in today. I'm very happy to be here and looking forward to our conversation.
Great. It's really nice to see you again. We don't see each other enough, and we'll have to solve that problem someday. Okay, well, I'm going to jump into my first question then. This is a broad question, but I just want to begin so that people out there, the audience, gets to hear from you directly on this question. And the question is, what has been your vision of how we should seek to approach and understand work, learning, and social change from a critical labor education perspective? Can you speak to that? It's a broad question, but can you speak to that?
Well, of course. I've been thinking about this for decades now. And pretty soon I'll come up with a good, clear, concise answer. But in the meantime, what can I say? Let's take the piece about learning. To me, it was a breakthrough realizing that, in the words of Alan Thomas, education is a small boat that floats upon a sea of learning. So there's this huge expanse of human experience, which is about learning and personal change, changes in perception and in knowledge that people go through. And we have the privilege of being able to look at this carefully and intently and rigorously. So to that extent, I am drawn to the academic world because rigor maybe is preached more than it's practiced, but I identify with it strongly. And I also do because I think the workers deserve the best. And what that means is not to serve up secondhand ideas or the ideas of 20 years ago, but to sharpen our own thinking continuously. And that's the process of learning inside ourselves. So I always think of it as we have to look through the video, but we also have to look in the mirror. And that look in the mirror, uncomfortable though it may seem, is a necessary connector. Because what we look for when you're talking about work is work that is connected to people's desires, that fills some need that they have beyond just survival. So I think that the connection aspect, particularly to other workers, is a central part of the concern. And that is something I've examined in practice and in theory through all these years, because that is the mystery of solidarity. Now, unions generally in the culture, as I've even written, are better at thinking about how to fight the boss than they are about how to love your neighbor. But both are required, because a union without solidarity has no energy to it. It has no momentum to it. And it's that momentum that constitutes the attractive kind of tug on people to become involved and to make a contribution. And that contribution is about affirming themselves. So that's the aspect of power that comes up. Labor movement's all about power. Power inside, power in relation to the employer, power in the society, unequal power, as we're seeing so much under neoliberalism, this rupture that has occurred between working people and those who govern. And to close that gap is also, I think, part of the task of labor education. So when I think about how these things relate to each other, work and learning and social change, I think about it in a very practical way. I'm humble in the sense that maybe I should have put my energies someplace else. Maybe the labor movement, some days I think the hell with it. I give up, you know? I watch it involved in internal battles governed by rumor rather than thought. I see sporadic little bouts of militancy snuffed out, either by employers or by their internal hierarchies. These are things that break your heart if you put your heart into the work. And whatever else I can say, I have put my heart into the work.
Look, can I come back to a lot of ideas there? Because in the midst of this description that you provide of a vision, there's actually some really specific things that might not quite have been, the audience might not have caught the specificity of the kind of subtlety of the things you were saying, like the idea, for instance, of the workplace as relating to the combination of, I'm just going to pose this as a bit of an opening commentary that becomes a question. The combination of, it's a sneaky, radical vision of what work could be in the sense of energy, momentum, human purpose, feelings, experience, and this is the combination, key combination, solidarity and questions of power. That stew of principles. Do you think, as I would argue this and see how you feel about it, that a labor education perspective is about the unity of those elements, at least those elements of the stew, for a serious investigation? It goes deeper than just good, say, human resource, just good quality, good old-fashioned human resources and all this kind of support for workers to have a decent kind of experience at work. The elements of a labor education perspective on work is a unique stew. Does that make any sense to you when I'm speaking of that?
Absolutely, I recognize it. A stew is actually a good image because little bits float up to the top at a given moment, and it is steamy. It is passionate, right? There's heat there. And it's that heat that I know drew me in. I guess I wanted my adult life to be intense. And the labor movement has provided that for me. Not that reflection isn't valuable, and sitting back and contemplating, I value that, but I lead with my heart. And in the labor movement, that is possible. And I think the fact you put these, some may think, disparate elements together, it does mix into a stew, and it does because of relational thinking. So I think to make sense out of labor education, you have to spend some time thinking about relations. You have to think, what is the relation actually between social change and labor education? Well, you can't be too explicit about trying to change the hierarchies of the world, because then the people above you are going to get nervous. But if you're not doing some of that, they're counting on you doing some of that. They need you doing some of that. So they both need it, and they are nervous about it. And I think you're on that emotional edge with leaders. Michael Newman wrote that lovely book, The Third Contract, in Australia, where he talks about, well, there's a contract of the educators with the sponsors, the educators with the participants, and then the participants with the sponsors. Now, most practicing adult educators focus primarily on the relation of the educator with the participants. And that's what the book that you referred to, Education for Changing Unions, is primarily about that. Methodologies, activities, things that work, how to show respect for people without catering to prejudice, how to respect experience without letting it drive the bus. So we want not common sense, we want good sense. And to work through that process in good Gramscian kind of thinking requires us to really look carefully at the mixed sense that people have, full of myths and inherited prejudices and ideas, memories, often of ancestors that are not relevant to the immediate environment. So sorting through the relations amongst these disparate elements is the intellectual challenge of labor education. Because until you have that clear in your own body, you can't model it for others. And we all know that modeling it is much more important than saying it.
Well, we're bridging into the idea of critical labor education as a form of, say, also at the same time, action research in essence. And but even more so, I want to get back to my next question I'm going to have here is about sources that have inspired you. And you brought up the work of Mike Newman in the Third Contract. This business about, there's a way of thinking about that kind of infrastructure, a relational infrastructure. It was really well put, I thought, the way you said that, as being inherent to an action, maybe action research, but action and activism engagement and labor educator, labor member engagement with a vision of work and learning that is quite different. As the three kind of relational contracts you mentioned, for example, could be seen as an inherent, existing, partially or potentially existing and furbished set of relationships of what work and learning and social change are. So there's also an action research perspective in good critical labor education going on. Does that jive with your kind of overall direction here?
I think that action research is the heart of this, because in education, in good adult education, even mainstream good adult education, you do some kind, don't you, Peter, of a needs analysis, a needs survey, then you analyze it a bit. So you got some idea of what you're walking into. If you don't understand the environment, if you haven't done a little conjunctural analysis, you're not equipped to really deal with what's going on. And what's going on isn't always on the surface, because there's great diversity amongst the educators in terms of our views on what social change means and what we see our role in it. But there's also amongst, there are an awful lot of participants who are workers who just want to finish the shift and get off the workplace, out of the workplace, and maybe they've got a little spare energy to help out some friends who are in trouble. And that's how they wind up in one of these union courses. They kind of stumble in because nobody else will do it. And somebody's got to stand up because they can see that there's all kinds of crap going on in the work environment. So they step forward, but they are not ideologically committed to social transformation. They're just trying to help out some friends and be decent citizens in that sense. They're probably also involved in, in a church congregation in their community. They probably coach hockey. They're just decent, kind people. And they are in there, and then next to them is somebody who's a raving militant. And your job as the educator is to bring those two people to see the beauty in each other. And that beauty is present in them, and different writers, you asked about important writers, have touched on that. I think Helena Worthen, for example, in Illinois, in the United States, has done lovely work on the dynamic and the texture of workplace relations. Bell Hooks, who has written on so many aspects of living, but on work as well, and did such a brilliant critical essay on Paulo Freire. Don't know if you've read it, but in it she says, Paulo sort of muddied up his water with some sexism. That's unfortunate, but if you're really thirsty enough, muddy water is better than nothing.
Yeah.
And I'm taking it, right? I think that there are, in French, Michel Blondin, brilliant, really the father of union education as it's practiced in Quebec. And it's quite distinct, the approach that they have taken in his comment of how to stay with the group. That's how he says it, group. And the discipline of staying with the group, when really you only want to talk to the three progressives that are in the room. So there's a group of participants, and you're spontaneously drawn to certain individuals. And the tendency to bounce ideas off them, to follow their body language is great. And the discipline, the rigor, is to say if there are 27 others in the room, every one of them is a learner, and you have a responsibility to each one of them. And that's what Michel Blondin taught and modeled, and people learned it all across Quebec. And amongst them, there are these differences in power, about which we've learned a lot in recent years. So my great teacher on that, won't surprise you, is my partner, Barbara Thomas, who's written her own books, much more. She's a much better writer than me too, but she has written widely on issues of equity in organizations as a white woman with an anti-racist stance. So these people are people I've spent time with, that I have learned from directly, and that I consider part of an ongoing dialogue to bring together the stew of which you're talking. But all of us are walking on bridges that others have built, whether it's Lev Vygotsky, of course, Mechthild Hart in the United States on living and working. She's got great stuff on that. Michael Newman on teaching defiance, as well as the third contract. And of course, the person who most inspired me, who was Paulo Freire. This sort of awkward, remote-looking guy who pauses sometimes to my impatience in commenting on things that are under the surface of our interactions. And his daring contribution of saying the illiterate knows. The illiterate is a source of knowledge. I have to say, transformed my life. And I carry that directly into labor education. I've just been doing, of course, a kind of train the trainer course. My next session today is a Thursday. It's on Monday, 3 hours. And the theme is the member knows. And it's about how do we investigate? And I commend this to graduate students, right? To think, how do you find out what the participant already knows and how they learn?
I was going to say, can you maybe give us a little more context of your kind of taking up of your experience with Freirean thought in the concrete and your experience? Could you say a little more of that context? Because I have over the years thought that the Freirean insights have been a kind of a glue across a lot of, I know you've investigated a lot of kind of avenues. And I still remember, this is going to maybe not tweak a bell for you, but I remember because it was a funny experience for me as a young researcher when we had a meeting with a guy. Do you remember the name Jean Sylvestre?
Of course. Yes.
And we had a meeting and you walked in with a French translation of Vygotsky's, I think, Thought and Language. I can't remember the title. And you kind of threw it on his desk, and we were talking about research planning and all this stuff in your context of when you were coordinator of the research center we had together, and we spent time together at the University of Toronto. But and I remember that kind of being an emblem of the many avenues which you've bothered, maybe we're driven to explore in terms of these sources. But then to bring it back, I always, rightly or wrongly, felt that Freirean element was the key for the hidden capacities of all people, and as a kind of a glue that helps you decipher which other avenues were most important. Maybe it's a little metaphoric, but back to my first thing, you can either comment on that, but also just provide a little more context of your kind of introduction and engagement with the Freirean tradition, especially if you happen to agree with my metaphor about the glue. We got stews, we got glues. Anyways, can you talk a little bit more of the background in your engagement with the Freirean, your experiences around that?
Well, I was a student myself, grad student, looking at experiences of popular education in Latin America. And of course, wherever I went, and I went to different places, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, inquiring about how did this motivating philosophy play out in polarized situations. I mean, these were ones with elites that knew they were elites, and they wanted to keep it that way. So this required courage, and of course led to the exile of many people, including Paulo Freire himself. So I had to pursue Freire himself to Geneva, where he was working in the World Council of Churches. I simply decided, all right, I've got to go to the source. I went there and spent time with him in Geneva, somehow talked my way into his apartment, and we spent a long afternoon, and subsequently he came and spent time in Toronto, where we talked together and worked together, because there was a Brazilian group of exiles in Toronto at the time, and I was very close to them. So we would get together, and there the conversations were in Portuguese. And I will say that this desire that you noticed, I grew up in an Anglo bubble myself, but I thought the most important compliment that you can give to a person of another culture is to know their language. Because with it comes a whole view of the world. Just an example, I grew up in Anglo Ontario in Hamilton, and on the classroom wall was a map of the world, and on the map of the world there were areas that were marked in pink, and they were the British Empire. That was still true. They erased that and put Commonwealth, but they meant the same thing. And it was the dominion of English language. And I thought that all maps were like that till I was in Montreal, and I saw maps that had the map of the world with, in pink, I don't know why, also those locations like Martinique, right? And Côte d'Ivoire and Senegal and all these other places where France had colonized. And actually they had, it hit me, they have a different map of the world in their heads since they were 6 years old. No wonder they don't think like me. No wonder they have these ideas that I don't share spontaneously. Maybe I could shut up and ask questions. And to me, it's that spirit of inquiry, the asking of questions, and the willingness to do the sweat, it's work to learn a language. But you don't have to get far before people start helping. You get out a few sentences and people say, "Oh, it's okay, Darcy. You speak English and I'll speak French," right? And we find those kinds of saw-offs along the way. To me, getting out, English is the dominant language of the world now. To move from English is an act of solidarity culturally. If you are coming in from the Philippines and you don't speak English, you are going to learn it. If I go to the Philippines, I don't have to learn Tagalog unless I want to. That is an act of solidarity. And so the learning of language, I think, is an important gesture. To go back, though, to why this pulls together into a vision of popular education is to say, when we are talking to workers, we have to be talking their language, their English, their Newfoundland accented English. We don't have to imitate it. That actually irritates people. But we have to be able to follow it and get used to the lilt of it and enjoy it and demonstrate that pleasure in our interactions. So whether it's learning a whole other language or whether it's learning, what do they say, difference between a dialogue, difference between a dialect and a language is who controls the army.
I've not heard that one. Wow. Yeah.
So the exchange of languages is an exchange of power. And for English speakers, the gesture of learning another language, even a bit of it, is a choice around power. And that is consistent with the choice of my work with Freire, the work that he assigned to me and my Brazilian friends to spend time in a small place called Sao Tomé and Príncipe off the west coast of Africa, in which we drew together, what can I say? We drew together wall newspapers in the market. We had people taping interviews on the street and bringing them in so that people on the local radio could hear the voices of their neighbors not just the voices of people that taught academic Portuguese. And they would broadcast also in indigenous languages other than Portuguese on that. And we coached and supported that work. That's all popular education work. That's all building on, but not romanticizing the knowledge of the people who are coming into our learning programs. And I love the labor movement. I do not romanticize it.
Right. I know what you mean. You often talked about warts and all, and looking at things for its potential and how it is and all this kind of stuff. The popular education stream or tradition within labor education, that's a very specific experience of spending time with workers. And imagine, because I got a chance to do this in a way. I mentioned at the outset in the introduction that it was really important for, it still is important because it formed the infrastructure of my own research program, just as a personal case in point here. And I was wondering what could be gained from serious researchers of work, learning, and social change to spend time in a popular education inflected labor education environment, experience, program, and stuff like that. Like, to make a kind of an extreme statement, should every work learning researcher spend some time in a labor, especially a popular education accented labor education environment?
I think it's an ideal learning environment for people to get the feel of it, because the labor movement is so intensely political. It's so intensely related around power. Now, for example, when I teach or facilitate a session within, I'm doing one right now, and there are 8 participants. If I conclude that they are terrible people and didn't work hard at all, I could report that to their higher ups. If they concluded that I was an arrogant jerk and they reported that up to the higher up, who do you think has more power then? I'm out. I'm out. You're in an environment in which participants are not only talkative, they can drive you out.
They're empowered.
They're empowered. They have made a choice in their lives, which is to step up in support of fellow workers and not be pushed around. So they're damn well not going to be pushed around by me. And I do remember one occasion, I don't know I ever mentioned this to you, where I had a real clash with a group. And the group started to make fun of me, that they knew more, they thought, about grievance handling than I did. And thank God they did. They were stewards and chief stewards, so it's lucky that they did. But they caught me on something, proved that I was wrong, and started to drive it. And I said, well, I understand your point. So what we're doing here is we're preparing for you to teach a course on Thursday. At that point, it was Tuesday morning. I said, so since you're so confident about how well you understand everything, I'm just going to step into the room next door and I'm going to look at some videos. And if you ever want me to come back in because you have a question or anything, let me know. Otherwise, you guys go ahead and prepare your own course for Thursday. You've got a manual, go ahead. About half an hour later, one of the people came in and said, it's good you stood up for yourself, or we would have pushed you out of the room. And we understand, come back, we're going to work together with you. And it was a recognition that they knew some things, and about education, I knew some things that they needed. So we could have an exchange based on mutual respect, but also on an understanding that the world is a tough place and people get pushed in and pushed out. And you better be very careful if you push.
Well, I mean, I've had kind of versions of that experience because in my own teaching, and having to do, when it goes well, having it evolve in those same ways, but understanding those dynamics. I'm still caught with this idea of how important it is that someone who wants to speak about work learning and God forbid social change as well, whether within a labor movement, the organized labor movement, or the unorganized labor movement, in the sense that, not in a formal sense, but organized as a culture of workers in a workplace and all this kind of stuff, is exposure from a certain kind of perspective and outlook to those dynamics, because they're very complex. The history, the emotional aspects of learning in life, the realism of challenges, limits, i.e. the world's a tough place, the realities of power and its transformations. These exposures of researchers, it's such a missed opportunity for people not to have at least had the types of exposures that people like me, for instance, did vis-a-vis you and others. You remember? Oh gosh, I'm losing my track with all the names in my head. I can't quite get them sometimes now. It's a new thing for me.
Bruce Spencer, maybe?
Sure, but and being invited and exposed to the necessary complexities of humanness, and the complexities of work and power, and of organization and solidarity. Like, it's a complex stew. To admit the complexity is something that people have to first recognize, that there is something to admit. I just think that the idea of the researchers being exposed to this might be crucial. There might be other ways. I don't know if you can imagine other ways that researchers can get that complexity. That there is another standpoint on these questions. I just feel like everybody should do time as a labor education assistant, we'll say.
Well, I think that time, that word you just used, is the key to this, because you want to walk with people, and people can tell whether you're just observing them or whether you're connecting with them, right? What is it Camus said, solidaire et solitaire, that's what you're after, right? You want solidaire, people believe that you respect them, but you do have a different role than they have when you're there as a participant observer. And I think that pursuing that is extremely valuable, because over time, you'll see the same person quiet in a classroom, and then challenging something that happens in a classroom, and then bad talking somebody in the corridor outside the classroom, because you realize, oh, they're running against each other in the upcoming elections. And then in an early morning on a picket line, showing some courage and some stamina. And you say, okay, this person, you may be observing one person, but you're not. You're observing a culture, and that is the union culture. So my little book that you mentioned and showed, the Thinking Union book, is about the union culture. And that was the core of my doctoral thesis as well, saying that there are certain features you can, I'll put it this way, in a variety of countries that I have worked, Malaysia, Australia, Hong Kong, Tennessee, I can smell a unionist. I can tell.
Mhm.
It's in their reflexes. It's in their way of talking. It's in the way that they present themselves and their work environment. So I think that it's important to spend that kind of time. And bear in mind, in any of the unions now, at least in North America, the narrow construction of auto workers belong to the auto workers union is gone.
Mm.
It's now the union is called Unifor. And in it, there are people working in long-term care facilities and automobile assembly plants. And they're miners. Well, I can tell you from experience, having taught with all three of those groups, that those are very, very different educational environments in which to work.
Hmm.
And if you are actually doing something with the goal of connection and dialogue, you have to have experienced and tasted enough of a range to be able to make generalizations that are real.
Mm.
And I'm cautious about generalizations about workers, but I can say that amongst union active people, there are certain features that you can pick out and that distinguish and, for me, attract me to them.
Mm-hmm. It's not a question I have written that I wrote down, but it comes up naturally in this type of question. The future of labor educational environments, where they exist, the way they're maybe where they will seep and open up into the future. Do you have any insights on that? Because if my kind of theory here of labor education being a major resource for active action research within the labor movement, outside the labor movement, where there's solidarities beyond, that it would behoove us to learn and get some comments from you on your gut feelings, or maybe your considered thoughts on what's coming up in the coming years, because there is a way to be pessimistic about the status of organized labor in places like North America. So what do you see for the kind of future of labor education environments and practices coming up, or the structure of labor education, the possibilities there? What do you see in the future? Kind of near and medium term, maybe?
Sure. Well, I think one measure that comes up frequently is, unions are losing density. And what that means is that the percentage of people who belong to of employed workers who belong to a union is declining. That, of course, is true in the United States. Incidentally, it's not true in Canada. It's stable in Canada overall. In Quebec, it's increasing. So just to say, I mean, if in Michigan, it might be at 11 or 12%. In most of English Canada, it's somewhere in the mid to high 20s. And in Quebec, it's around 40, 42. So be careful of generalizations about the decline, but that's only a numerical measure anyway. I think that the private sector unionism in industrial workplaces that generated the male masculinist image of the union activist, that its days are numbered. The public sector, predominantly women, in public service work of health and education and other areas, is holding or increasing. And I foresee that continuing and expanding. So that changes the character of union education. You're no longer dealing with people. There are people with serious political literacy challenges, but they're not technical literacy challenges. They can read and write. They just have no idea what's going on. And it's a different challenge. So because they're very cultivated in terms of their ability to handle PowerPoints. But they are not clear in terms of their ability to decode the differential impact of social ideas such as the minimum wage or the living wage or the minimum income, which is an idea that I support for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that the union of the future and the union education of the future is very much oriented towards that wider conception of workers.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of people who are in semi-professional and professional roles, lots of people who are looking at a wider range of policy issues that affect them as they go in and out of the labor market as gig employees, for example, and that affects them in their communities more than in their workplace. So an indicator would be, there's a very lovely organization that I commend to people, the United Association for Labor Education, UALE.org, based in the United States, run by Americans, good people. I've been on the board as we went through the process of adjusting from what they were initially, because initially they were a group of academics who were doing labor studies, labor-related teaching, maybe labor sociology or labor history or something, and they would get together. They merged with the people who were teaching inside unions, people like myself. And then the two of us merged with worker centers that are all over the United States now, that group many, in many cases, new immigrant workers, but people who are not unionized in the regular way. Used to be people would say, oh, they're not organized, which I think is a serious mistake. They're organized. Talk to them and find out how they're organized and how you can associate with that organizing.
Is this a
and
vision?
How you can get that energy, because that energy is what's going to infuse the other two, both the organized workplaces and the academy-based labor educators into a really rich dialogue. And if people have never had the experience of, as you say, assisting a labor educator, creating a space of free dialogue inside the hierarchical structure of a union, and keeping that space open and defending it and enriching it and stimulating it, critiquing it. If you haven't tasted that, you haven't eaten.
Okay, you know, you're describing something, a kind of a vision that's already emerging, I think, from what you say of the future that's already here, in the sense of, you know, almost from labor education to, or union education to, remember the term social unionism versus like craft unionism or things of this nature, industrial unionism, almost like social union education versus union education or something like that. Because it's an important difference. Like when you talk about public policy and so on and so forth, and public and context, social context, and I won't even comment on the idea, which I completely agree with you, that the organized culture existing in a formerly unorganized workplace is absolutely a vital realization for anybody hoping to grasp things that are happening in and around a workplace. Absolutely, it's good. There's a very important question I want to get to at the end, and I'm conscious of time and having kept you for a while. Your generosity, I don't want to extend it too much here. And it's a question I think is so important, which is advice you would give to new researchers. Now, I realize that a couple times I'm pulling on this string that relates to kind of especially new researchers in the comment you made at the end. But do you have other thoughts and advice you might give? One of the contexts of our interviews is that researchers, either young people or not so young people, wanting to get into studies of work, learning, and social change, to learn from what we're calling foundational voices who've worked a long time in the field, and what kind of points of advice they might have for them. Do you have any thoughts on that you want to share?
It's all about relationships. So what we're looking for is, I think, for a researcher that is a grad student, for example, checking with their professor whether if they've defined an area that they're particularly interested in, let's say healthcare, does your prof know anybody who is a rep in a nurses union or a healthcare union of any sort? The SEIU is very good, for example, in long-term care homes. That the student is saying, I just want to accompany the union rep and see what the work is like. And to gradually do that means they wind up stopping, having coffee, having lunch, informally communicating. And frequently that rep will be meeting up with people in semi-formal occasions. So to work on that side of just building, saying that you want to have a sense of it, and then at some point saying, well, what about the courses? Could I attend one? I've frequently had grad students attending a course. I particularly like it in an introductory steward course, because I think often people come in, grad students come in thinking it's all going to be about the grievance procedure, and they discover that actually it's about orienting the new stewards to the changes in their culture and attitudes that go on once they start standing up for their colleagues. There's a profound personal shift that happens. And you're walking with them through that. It's deep, Peter. And what a privilege to walk with people through that process. So I think that the route is A, go to your prof and through your prof. B, check out what the literature is that interested you and find out who of those people live within an hour's drive of you. Because in North America, if you're at a university or college, the person running the labor studies program, for example, at George Brown College, a woman named J.P. Hornick, longtime colleague of mine. I've worked with her in many, many meetings. And lo and behold, she ran inside her union for office. And imagine this, a month ago, she was elected president of the union. It's called OPSU, the Ontario Public Service Employees Union. It's 170,000 workers across Ontario. And J.P. Hornick is now the president. So people who may just be teaching you an introductory course in labor relations, who knows where they're going and who they know. And so anybody who is a colleague of J.P. Hornick knows to get in touch with J.P. and she will put their students onto a rep, and the rep will walk around with them. I emphasize the informality and be ready to spend time, including time that seems wasted. It's just waiting. But over time is the only way that you see the many facets of a labor activist.
Well, this is your cultural foundation argument of workplace and taking that as a foundational kind of observation orientation in the world, that there is a culture, and culture takes time. It's not learned in a book.
Yeah.
It's not even learned oftentimes kind of what's the best way to do it, consciously.
Yeah.
You know. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's true. Lots of it is not explicit, but when you get into something, for example, there may be a campaign of some kind going on, and you go into the campaign and you just follow the campaign. And the campaign might be to upgrade the part-time workers at a particular enterprise or part of the union, to upgrade them, to give them more attention. And you realize, oh, the union's been neglecting the part-timers too. Oops. It's good that they're doing this. And you pitch in, and there you are folding flyers, and you find yourself out there at 6 o'clock in the morning as people are going in, and you're handing stuff to people and saying, wait a minute, I thought this was graduate school. Yeah, that's graduate school. It gives you book, not book smarts, but street smarts.
Street smarts.
Yeah, if you don't have, yes, that was the title of my master's thesis, I think. So yeah, book smarts. People need them, and when you go into an environment, a culture that is rich in street smarts, and you're coming in with some humility with book smarts, and you're wanting to balance the two, man, that's an intellectual challenge. Now, if you're just going through and you want to get a degree, that's life. But if you want to really learn deeply, I think that this is a great route, which is to walk on both legs.
Well, it's a beautiful place to stop, and we could probably keep talking for a while, but I really appreciate, let me just end by saying how much I appreciate seeing you and you contributing this way, having put some thought and taking this conversation as seriously as you can, because I think it's really educational. Beginning with me, I learned some things even though I've known you for a while, and your turns of phrases have continued to flourish and evolve and blossom too. And those are the things that sometimes are the toehold to other learning for me. And I can't imagine that it wouldn't be for other people. Anyways, I want to thank you very much for taking time. And I guess I'll say goodbye, unless there's anything else you want to say at the end here.
No, grateful for the chance to talk with you.
Okay. And hope to see you again soon. Stay well, and goodbye.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.